Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Jacob Smith. I'm here representing a company called Altimetric and a project called the Collider, where essentially Altimetric, we are a digital transformation company helping organizations stay ahead of the curve with technology change and source innovation from within their teams. And the Collider, for those that aren't familiar, we are looking to build, it's a community hub for technical professionals with a focus right now in the Detroit area, but really anywhere. I see, folks are tuning in from all over the country. The interesting thing about virtual programs is that there's really no home base anymore. So we're providing awesome technical programming for everyone tuning in. Be sure to check us out. We'll drop some links in the chat, and we'd love you to connect. So without further ado, would love to go ahead and hand off the reins here to Nate Talbot, who is a Detroit-based distributed ledger enthusiast. He taught me the difference between distributed ledger and blockchain. So thank you, Nate, for the nuance. And also the co-founder of the Detroit Blockchain Center. In other words, he really knows his stuff, and I'm very excited to hand it over to him to guide along today's conversation. And also just want to note, if you have questions as we go here, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to work it in the best we can and kind of keep it an open, free-flowing conversation with Nate guiding the talk here. So take it away, Nate.
All right, thank you for the overhyped introduction. I'm partially what he said. Just as a quick, Detroit Blockchain Center, we're a nonprofit based on Detroit. We focus around blockchain advocacy and specifically around digital and financial literacy and education. And we have a couple other things we try to do in our work into the project, but education and advocacy around blockchain technology and distributed ledger technology is our core. And as you all know, today's conversation is the future of voting on the blockchain? And that is a massive conversation. And so to help guide that, we've brought in a few true blockchain experts where I will just generally guide a conversation and they will sort of lead us on this and address any of the questions and deeper delves that any of our participants today would like to visit. So I'm going to start with them and let them briefly introduce themselves before we get started, so you know the background. And I guess we'll start with Mark. You want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, Mark, and your background?
Sure. So I've founded a couple companies within the blockchain space. Most recently, it's a company called Numio, and I'm currently helping a couple other companies in the industry. One of which is Phoenix Staff, who is actually building out their own DAO currently, which is pretty exciting. As well as another project called Uptrend, which is a social media platform. And been in the space for about 5 years now, maybe 6 years, and was living in the Detroit area for about 6. And now I am based out of Florida.
Can I just ask, what's the current company do on a blockchain? Sorry, maybe I missed it.
So the company that I'm working with now, like my main focus is Numio. We're building out the application layer on top of Ethereum. So we're going to be releasing a mobile application in the next couple of weeks, which enables for peer-to-peer payments, identity management, and authentication. So
it's a private or public blockchain?
It's built on Ethereum, so, or
Okay, so
I should say it's built on public Ethereum. Should clarify there.
You just forked the Ethereum, right?
No. So we are building out on top of the public Ethereum blockchain.
Right. So I want to ask Thom the same thing, but as Thom's talking, I'd like for all our participants, so we can get sort of a feel of where our audience is. If you could just drop in the chat box, maybe your experience with blockchain, so we know how in depth or not in depth we need to go. Just beginner, medium experience, an expert. That way we have an idea. But go ahead, Tom. Let us know about what you're doing.
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Thom Ivy. I'm the Chief of Staff of Commonwealth Labs, which is a US-based software R&D company focused on blockchain and governance technology. Um, I am one of the first elected figures in a blockchain system, so I occupy kind of council or executive role within the network Edgeware, which is built in the new Polkadot ecosystem, which uses parity technology substrate. And substrate's really interesting because it's kind of the WordPress of blockchain, so it unlocks a lot of new business applications that get to just build on top of stuff instead of focusing on these underlying layer 0 and layer 1 blockchain problems. And my involvement here is mostly to talk about how we can test new voting technologies in blockchains first before deploying them to real life applications.
Awesome. I like the WordPress of blockchain. That's descriptive. It puts the whole idea in your head. Okay, so before we really get into the details of, the technical aspects of blockchain and voting and whatnot, I'd like for each of you to sort of address just voting in general, what areas you find are problematic and how voting is done in most areas now, and what are the issues that we might be able to address that could be better addressed, whether it's using blockchain or any other format. We'll start with you, Tom, on that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the things that our system does poorly right now, and will do poorly even when we solve it with blockchain voting, is basically like the finality of the results. So whether all eligible voters participated, do we have the complete set of voice? Whether those users are all eligible to begin with, are they dead or not? The verifiability of these results, do we have mathematical proof that when we tallied everything up that the results are true? Did we maintain anonymity so that your vote is secret? And that's important because it means that you can't sell or buy votes effectively. So anonymity is a huge part of the system. And then making sure that people haven't reused votes.
Okay, awesome. And how about you, Mark? Do you have any points around that?
I mean, he definitely summed it up pretty well there. But I think on top of that, I think the incentives for people to want to vote, I think that can be a big thing, because I think one of the main drivers around voting and wanting to participate in voting, aside from like political beliefs and what you personally believe in, is your time, and in looking to incentivize people to participate in something. And I think that is a big driver as to why a lot of people do vote, is because it impacts them financially in some way or another.
Okay, great. So in addressing some blockchain, more specific issues, and I'm going to ask, regardless of your level here, we're all going to make a couple good faith assumptions about blockchain, and at the very core aspects of it, that is in one way or another, it's some kind of decentralized, whether it's public or private. The very base fundamentals, the math of it just works. And that way we don't have to get into too many deep dives into the core specifics.
Sorry, Nate, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
How does a private could possibly be decentralized?
How is a private chain decentralized?
No, you said that regardless if it's private or public, as long as it's decentralized. I do not understand the concept of private and decentralized at the same time. To me, they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, no, if that came across, I wasn't saying private or public decentralized. I was saying that they're both distributed in the case, and the math works, whether you're talking on a public or a private. They definitely have some different issues, especially when you're talking about the decentralization piece. So yeah, I wasn't saying that a private is the same. But with that being said, and again, I'll start it off with you, Mark. Can you give me sort of a overview in your perception of how a blockchain works, especially when it comes to addressing some of the issues you mentioned? um, in those areas of blockchain or areas of voting? I'm sorry.
Well, I think I can definitely touch on some of the stuff that Thom has mentioned, and some of the solutions that blockchain can bring is obviously how information can't necessarily be tampered with on a public and distributed blockchain. It can be very difficult. Obviously, when it comes to a private blockchain that is permissioned, all of that information can be tampered with, it can be changed. But when you're dealing with many public blockchains, that is not the case. And that allows for any information that is stored on there, whether it's a transaction, any type of data, it is not able to be changed. And that allows for data availability. It allows for that information to be audited, and allows for an immediate response when it comes to the outcome, in this case, for a vote. And it doesn't necessarily require people to go back and say, okay, we need to go and review all of this information. It is all there available on a public ledger.
Great. And Tom, sort of the same question. And if you could, after you address that, sort of, can you outline a general process of how you see voting on a blockchain, how that would work or what that process would look like?
I mean, I think in the ideal, it would lovely to be as simple as I am already logged in through some decentralized identity that is provably me, and I open up an app, and on the date of voting, I can engage all of the questions. I can see maybe pre-election polls or signals that allow me to vote with more understanding of how my peers operate. So think like 2016, we all thought, someone was maybe going to win, so maybe some of us stayed home. That's a flaw in elections that can be resolved through efficient signaling processes like polls. So we can do polls, and I can read those and see how things are trending over time. And then I can choose my options, verify my selection. And I think this is the key part, is that I need probably some sort of backup to prove that this is what I've done. So maybe it pings my printer. My printer prints me out this really nice QR code, schemed thing that relates to a transaction on a blockchain that is auditable and verifiable.
Okay. What about you, Mark? Is there any other aspects to that you would add in to like the process, how blockchain, how the whole process would flow?
I think on a global level, it has to be able to be done on a mobile device, mainly because when we're dealing with desktops, laptops, and things like that, a lot of people around the world don't actually own them. And even here in the US, using mobile devices on a day-to-day basis, let's say for mobile payments, even though we're not going to get into that, it's not really something that we use very frequently. We're just not adjusted to that. And being able to do all of these things on just as simple as a mobile device to, as Thom said, being able to verify ourselves. And one of the issues that brings in is things like a Sybil attack. What a Sybil attack is when you have different types of pseudo-anonymous identities that are able to sway, let's say, a vote in one way or the other, with just having one single identity, but it's not necessarily provable. And that can be fairly difficult doing that in a complete online environment, because a lot of people don't necessarily have all of the identity documentation that are required for participating in some of these things. And some people don't necessarily even have internet. And when you're dealing with a blockchain, I mean, you can take raw data that's offline and be able to store that within a blockchain, but you're going to still deal with the same issues that you would have in current systems now. And it would just require every single individual participating in something to all be able to access the internet and be online, which is definitely an obstacle, to say the least.
Cool. And in that, because we're talking about any kind of electronic voting, as you mentioned, mobile phones, and I'm bringing this to Tom, but how is there a way? There's a concern around voting on blockchain with just like malware on people's devices, right? The blockchain might be secure, but how do we know it's secure between the device and the blockchain? And is there anything, at least even down the pipeline, that you see that could help resolve for that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like the holy grail of that would be a new device that has never been connected to the internet. You load the keys onto, and you perform the transaction, the vote signature. This is me. You do all this offline, and then it talks to your printer directly, and you get this sheet, which proves your signature, your signing. In lieu of that, yeah, I mean, there are some things using secure enclaves that might be interesting. In the maybe 5 to 10 year future, we might see something called a homomorphic encryption take over in combination with secure enclaves, so that we have relatively strong guarantees that the logics that are being run are untampered with within this chip that kind of gets integrated in part of your computer. And many of our devices already support this enclave. And in the kind of far future, we can use homomorphic encryption to basically perform compute over totally obscure data. So I don't know what you voted, but I can still tally up, what the results are and mathematically prove them to be true. So the combination of those two things, I think, is like the futurist holy grail.
Okay. And then I know, Mark, you said what you're building now, you're working on the Ethereum chain. And for people who are not maybe familiar, Ethereum's another blockchain that allows you to do more programming than a Bitcoin blockchain would allow you to do. But there is the issue, and I saw this in the comments, there is the issue of like transaction fees. And so if we're asking people to vote on a blockchain, and that blockchain incurs transaction fees for every usage, which means they have to pay sometimes a small fee, sometimes depending on traffic, right, a large fee. How do we address that? And how do we handle that?
For sure. And that's actually something that our team are actually working on implementing right now. Within the Ethereum ecosystem, and actually, I bet Tom is going to jump in and talk about what they're doing at Edgeware on top of Polkadot, because Polkadot you can think of actually as an Ethereum scaling solution, although it would be considered a bridge onto another blockchain. And within Ethereum, there are actually layer 2 scaling solutions on top of Ethereum that allow you to have extremely high transactions per second and low gas costs. So for example, some of those different types of scaling solutions are ZK rollups, which stands for a zero knowledge rollup that allows you to take a ton of different types of data and store them into a single transaction block onto Ethereum. And that allows you to have pretty much instant transactions, and the gas costs are like 100 times less. And then you have things like Plasma, which are storing data off chain, pretty much up in the cloud. And that's a similar solution to things like state channels in the sense that you're storing data off chain. And then we have things that are called optimistic rollups. This is another type of scaling solution on Ethereum. And all of these have different types of pros and cons, whether it's with regards to scalability or even security as a part of these solutions. I personally am a fan of zero knowledge rollups. There's a couple different types of zero knowledge proofs that you can use within these that allow you to have extremely small bite size of data, which can allow this information to be stored and transferred at extremely high speeds and at a low cost. So some of those two main ones that are currently being used right now are ZK Starks and ZK Snarks. So a ZK Snark is a succinct, gosh, I'm having a brain fart right now. It's a, so I'm just gonna stick with a ZK Snark and a ZK Stark, just to keep it a little bit more simple there. Even though that is a little bit complex. But that allows you to take large amounts of data and communicate those to Ethereum in a secure and scalable fashion.
Okay. I'm going to sort of bounce it. I wanted to, I think Marina brought up a good point earlier about the public versus private. And, you know, decentralization is a gradient, right? It's not just a binary here or there. So I'm going to sort of let her sort of enumerate on her point, but I'm interested in how the private versus public chain would look on chain. Marina, do you want to?
I have a better point to make, and I feel like we're avoiding an elephant in a room. Basically, using, if we ever master it, and I'm saying if, using the blockchain for voting would avoid us going to Supreme Court, at least about how many votes and who voted which way, because you'll be able to go on a blockchain and see that your vote is counted the way you voted. Because remember the last time we went to Supreme Court for about the presidential election, it's who voted which way and prove it, and maybe you change your mind and blah, blah, blah. All of that is going to be illuminated by a blockchain.
Right.
So
yeah.
One of the things I was going to mention that the pricing on votes is not that big of a deal. Who is paying for the elections now? How much is each state is paying to hold the elections? It's going to be so much cheaper on a blockchain that the state can pay for it, or the federal government, or the local, whoever is paying now, because it's going to be less than 1% of what they pay in the poll takers who are at the polls, blah, 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 and all the machines that they waste their money on that don't work and they have to be maintained and all that crap. So the pricing is not going to be an issue. Even if Ethereum pricing will go 100 times more, it's still going to be cheaper than a human being sitting at the poll all day taking your votes. And then somebody counting and recounting and this and that. And the machines right now, as we all know, software is always cheaper than hardware, blah, blah, blah. So that's such a secondary issue to vote in that it's not even funny. I posted a bunch of Supreme Court amicus briefs from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, if you know what it is.
Yep.
And from Mozilla Mozilla Foundation. Everybody knows what Mozilla Foundation is. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I saw those. We're gonna check those out. But I would like to get Tom's sort of input too on some of those points, especially like, again, there's the public chain. So I know she also brought up earlier votes. So like West Virginia has been using blockchain voting, I think for about a year now, maybe a little bit more, for troops deployed overseas. And they found some success, but of course, Votes is built off of, I believe, more of a private chain structure. And so, you know, private chains, again, if people understand, there's public chains like Ethereum and Bitcoin, which are decentralized.
I
And
posted the vulnerabilities that was found with West Virginia FBI found the thing. I don't know if you
right,
saw that link.
right, yep. So you have you have public chains that are decentralized, which can be very transparent. You can see everything that's happening on chain. And then you have private chains, which could be controlled by a small cabal of companies, or it could be a government controlled chain. So what's your viewpoint on the usage of a public versus private chain?
You know, private chains, I feel like it's just a completely different space that I've been in for so many years now. So I can't speak totally in their credentials or their capabilities rather, but I think it's a matter of who do you want to own the systems that that control your resources and control your life. Would you like it just as a matter of trust, even if they could mathematically prove for now that the results were verifiable and untampered with, etc. Why? When, again, like Marina says, the cost of running this should be so low over time that there is no reason that we can't do it all by hosting it on our own phone or a laptop, if should we be lucky enough to have them around the world. Or like today, there are decentralized agencies, states, Secretary of States, local municipalities that execute our vote in the US now. So as long as we can kind of keep what we do now for the bare minimum of decentralization, which is a gradient in the spectrum, I think we're in good shape.
Okay. You have anything you want to add to that part, Mark? The private versus public?
I mean, it's probably not something that I think everyone here wants to think, or I guess work towards, but in reality, I do think that especially in government voting, that we're going to move towards using blockchain, but it's not going to be on a public blockchain. It is most likely going to be used with something like Hyperledger, R3 or Corda, or frankly, just a fork of Ethereum and running their own private network. Like that's what Consensus is, one of the big firms who's actually building out and funding a lot of the public goods on Ethereum. And they're actually one of the drivers for private Ethereum. So Ethereum Enterprise is what I'm referring to. And most likely they're going to want to have full control over that system. And in reality, if we're using a private network, it's really not going to be much different than what it is now. A private blockchain it's literally just a regular database for the most part. There's so little differences in them. But I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong. I don't know. But I do know that governments, they want to have control. I mean, we're seeing what's going on in China with their government issued currency, which is actually running on a blockchain, but it is a private blockchain. And everyone last year was getting all excited. China was talking about blockchain, and they were building out their own central bank digital currency, which was, I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty awesome. That's cool. But the reality is, it is running on a private network. So it doesn't really change anything that a lot of people in blockchain are working towards, because they're able to get the same solution that they have now, just with, I guess, an added buzzword, in my opinion.
I could add something to that as a response.
Get away.
From my work in the Polkadot ecosystem using Parity Substrate, which is the technology platform I mentioned earlier, that we also have a dev actually on that platform, is in the chat. Just hate you. On the private level, the one thing you cannot do is vote on the rules about voting itself. So if you want meta levels of control, if you want to change your constitution or change how you tally votes, or how many, like whether you have one person, one vote, or quadratic voting or whatever, unless that's built into that system, probably good luck executing it as a runtime change without the permission of those private entities. So it's a matter of how deep do you want to go in your stack of civil technology. And I think that people ought to own the whole damn thing.
That's an excellent point. And you sort of bring me into where I wanted to take the conversation next. But before we go there, I do want to open it up if there are any questions about or points people want to make about where we've covered so far. Whether you drop that in the chat or unmute and just speak up real quick. And
I think that it's so early in the game as far as blockchain technology. I mean, even with us folks that have been in the, monitoring the space or invested in the space for many, many years, it does seem like time moves a lot faster. But like, from what I gather, if you're an outsider, you're not thinking about it. It's not a thing. I think I was at a meetup last November. It was a tech meetup, and people were. I would talk to people, and I'd ask them about, hey, I tell them I work in the blockchain space, and the response from more than a few of them was, well, blockchain. I thought is that still a thing? I thought that was dead, and so I was like dying inside. But I think it just goes to show that there's a lot of work to go and a lot of trust to build before we're at any sort of like national level. Because, just if you were just to talk about electronic voting with people, just the skepticism now with what exists, rightly so, is just such a huge a barrier for most folks to just even begin to want to accept, even given all the flaws with ballot voting, paper ballots. So I think
the devil we know,
there's still
right?
some work to do, but I think on a local level, or even like a community level, I think that it could be ripe for something like that, because existing systems in just local communities, you could see a lot of efficiencies, and just given security models that are existing now without identification being set in stone, like with in the Ethereum space, for instance, it could still be, where you just have local municipalities or school boards or clubs just assigning people a private key, and that would be good enough given what exists now. So I think it'll be incremental, and by the time it gets to considered nationally or like on a broad scale like that, hopefully the tech will advance to a point where it's ready.
You bring up a good point that also aligns sort of what Thom was talking about. All voting isn't created equal, right? And so in US politics, we deal with that first past the post style voting. Whoever sort of gets the most votes wins. I'm excited about things like ranked choice voting, but I know within the DAO community, the decentralized autonomous organization community, building on blockchain, quadratic voting is a big thing. And I don't really know if quadratic voting would work for a public goods voting system, but there are a lot of different options. And if you're going to talk about transitioning from traditional, that first past the post, go to a ballot box and write your results on a piece of paper, to blockchain or any other kind of electronic voting, to me, it seems like the also perfect time to talk about voting systems. So Thom and Mark, let's start with Mark. In your opinion, with all the different voting models that are out there, what do you think works best for which kind of scenarios? And especially with the point Brian brought up, there's local elections you can do, which maybe or maybe not be handled best when you talk about like on a national level election.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's a multifaceted one.
Yeah.
Well, let me just start with this. Every single style of voting that you're going to have is going to have its different types of pros and cons. Let's say, for example, if you're voting with a token economy, for example, you can have a benefit because you can have centralization. Because if they're, let's say, like a token like MakerDAO, which is a fairly prominent project within Ethereum, there is a form of centralization within MakerDAO's voting system where a large amount of early investors are able to vote on proposals and participate within this DAO. So the benefits to that are you can somewhat entrust that these parties are looking to most likely do good for this ecosystem. It's bad because that can potentially impact the greater community, because if you're just a small fish out there, you can't really put your word in. Your word doesn't really mean anything. And then you can have a negative impact on situations where it's just a single vote is all you get. So when it deals with a lot of capital, that can potentially impact how a system runs. So for example, obviously here, like in the US, when you're voting, one person has one vote. And that can potentially have both its pros and its cons. Because when it comes to its pros, you have the feedback from everybody, or the majority of people who are voting. Everyone has the same voting power. But on the downside, you could potentially have it be impacted by people who don't necessarily know what is best for the future of whether it's a small little economy or whether it's a macro economy, because not everyone is knowledgeable about these things. I mean, frankly, like if you told me, all right, Mark, you got to go run the government, I'd be like, all right, government's going down with me. And then that's one of the negatives to it. But then we have things like quadratic voting, which is, I'm not going to lie, it is a UX nightmare. It is awful. The first time that I did it was like a year and a half ago, and I had no clue what was going on. None whatsoever. I was like, what is going on with this? How does this work? Screw it. I'm just scribbling some things on a piece of paper. I give up. But the benefit for that is you can have a large majority of people be able to share feedback on something. And if a large majority of people are voting towards something, they can still sway a vote one way or the other. But if you're a big whale, let's say, for example, and you have people who are delegating votes to you as a politician or an individual, you can still put your vote forth, and it can potentially impact the vote one way or another, but it will not be enough to completely control the vote, if that makes sense. So a good real world example of how this formula operates, not necessarily quadratic voting, but the quadratic formula, can be found on Gitcoin. It is a platform for donating to open source goods, whether you're donating to things on Ethereum or Blockstack or Polkadot or just any type of open source good. And it's really cool. So you have all these people, let's say I have $1 million and I'm rich. And I'm like, all right, I made a ton of money. I'm just going to say, here's $1 million. The community can distribute that $1 million how they please. So all these people are able to go and vote on different types of public goods within Gitcoin, and they're able to, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a pro with how the formula works, but I just love the concept of it, where even if you're donating $1, your $1 can end up donating like $150 or even $200 to that public good. And as more and more people vote towards that public good, that number can actually increase, which is really cool. So that means if you have a really rich person who's like, all right, I'm just going to donate $100,000 to this one specific public good, it's great. You can still get that $100,000, but the amount that is matched is not going to be very much. Now, if you have the voice of a ton of people in the community, they are able to most likely overcome and donate even more money to a specific public good than just this one large donation from one single entity. Does that sort of make sense? I'm trying to explain it in a very general manner.
Yeah. I think it's coming across, and our chat box is going sort of ham with quadratic voting comments. Yeah, I guess one thing with quadratic voting that I know about, I think, in my personal opinion, it works better on private organizational type goals because of what you mentioned. If you're a millionaire, more money buys more votes, and that could be beneficial in certain areas. If we're talking about a Comcast stock, right? If I'm putting money into a company, I want to have more power with my vote. There are aspects of it where you wouldn't want that in a public vote. You don't want to have that with your vote for mayor. But with some public goods, there are some pieces of quadratic voting, and I guess I'll bring you in, Tom, for this part. Like a piece of that I'm talking about would be like your weight of votes, right? So a piece, I believe, of quadratic voting would be, maybe I've accumulated a weight of 5 votes, and I can put all 5 votes behind this one cause or person, or I could distribute them out equally amongst, my preferences, and that can be weighted and whatnot. Would that even work in a public type sector, or is that better kept for more private organizations?
That's a good question. I think, like you say, it's super ideal for private organizations or entities that already participate in shareholder style governance, where you have another resource that they use to buy into something at their discretion. So there's already, for instance, when you buy stock, you're saying, oh, I'm going to set aside $5 or $10 to buy this. And that discretionary choice already enhances the level of kind of fairness of the system. So it's not just saying, based on your total level of wealth, we're going to assign you this amount of political voice. There are a lot of variables and modulators that fall into play that allow you to express preference, time preference, priority. And so when you buy into a shareholder style governance, you're already kind of participating in a kind of quadratic voting, I guess is my point in some ways. So for those people, I think it'll be really natural. I think because we just kind of like went into quite a bit of it, and the chat box is exploring this on their own. It seems like I would love to bring in a different type that I think is a lot closer to being within reach for the American populace, if you don't mind. Sweet. So delegated voting. Delegated voting is exactly like the Electoral College, except more fair. So under delegated voting, you can take your vote on either your set of votes for the whole ballot. If there's 10 questions, you can give all 10 questions to somebody, or you could pick and choose certain questions that you want to give to experts that you know. So maybe you have a friend who's an economist, and Prop A is on a matter of the economy. So you delegate your vote and your voice to that expert there. And maybe that expert says, well, yeah, I have a BA in economy, but economics, but I know a PhD that I really trust, who I think very, very much understands the will of the people in Michigan, for instance. And so I'm going to delegate to him. And so you can have trees of delegation And so right now we're actually experimenting with this in our system, Edgeware. And under our rules, you have 5 levels of delegation deep. And it only goes that far because you want to prevent certain kinds of attacks. But so you can imagine that once you have, these trees set up, instead of trying to convince and compel 6 to 7 billion people on Earth to do something or around certain matters, you can understand the chain of authority and who the influencers are, so you get better data, and you can combine delegated voting with ranked choice or quadratic voting as well. And this frees up people to do something that they don't have a lot of free time to do, which is live their lives. I mean, I don't think everybody can be an expert on the extremely specific and nuanced questions that appear in our ballots these days. We're going to need experts empowered to make decisions for us. That's kind of is my spiel.
I want to delve into that delegated voting. The 2 red flags that pop in my head are, do you run into, which is absolutely what we have now, which you run into more of a battle of personalities where, let's say you're talking about an economist, but an economist has better decision making based on the fundamentals might not be as popular as an economist who's just really good at talking to people and has a personality. So how do you address that and making sure it doesn't siphon down to just a few votes of personality? And also, how do you, when you talk about any kind of proxy voting, where you're assigning your vote to somebody else, how do we prevent economic influence, buying the votes? Hey, here's this down the road for you if you let me vote for you on this proposition.
I don't know if that's something, the last point that you said, I'll let Tom jump in really quick, but the last point, I don't know if that's something that anyone can necessarily prevent, because I mean, that can be done offline. Like how can you prevent, all right, I'm going to give you $10 if you cast your vote to me and you delegate it to me. There's nothing that can prevent that. But there are punishments that you can put into place for people for trusting them. And a really cool use case that I saw of this was about 2 weeks ago with a project called Circles, which is they're building out a solution for UBI on blockchain. And in order to start receiving it, well, yeah, I like that one too. But an easy solution that they've done there is, in terms of trust, is if you trust that person and they end up being malicious to this network, then you stop receiving money. So how do you do that in a voting economy? Would you say, all right, if you become a malicious voter, does your vote now become worth half of what a vote is, or a fraction, or even none? And is that something that would be, frankly, okay for people to do? So then I'll let Tom sort of jump in there.
I would love a reminder of what the exact question was.
I screwed that up. That's on me.
No, I didn't. The distributed method you're talking about, it's what Mark was addressing. How do you avoid buying basically any kind of proxy vote? And then how do you keep it being from a battle of personalities versus a battle of the more knowledgeable? The scenario you laid out was, I trust these, I don't know science, I'm going to trust certain scientists. But in science example, Neil deGrasse Tyson is a very popular scientist. It doesn't make him the best scientist, it just makes him popular. How do we keep it from being my vote's going to go to the most popular, charismatic person?
I'll address the first one. So how do you avoid vote buying? So a big one is that the delegate recipient may not actually know whether they've been delegated to or how many votes they've been delegated to. All they know is that they need to make a decision, to the best of their abilities for their own sake, and others can ride that decision. 2, because you presumably have an anonymity around what, who delegated what to you, because you don't know what people's votes are, maybe what the delegation, vectors, I guess, are. There's not a lot you can do to kind of target the voting recipients and extort them or come after them later, because you won't know if they undelegate to you after. So even if I go and say, hey, here's $10, if you give me your vote, you take my money, and then you say, okay, sure, yeah, I did it. It's making things unable to be proved selectively and easy to prove selectively. And then, sorry, go ahead.
No, I like that answer. And it's just an issue we have now, and I see like Brian in the comments is posting out like it's an issue we have with like Congress. It's an issue we have now. I agree with Mark's earlier statement that we can't. It's hard to eliminate just buying the votes, but we don't want to make it easier, for anybody as well. And not to pick on any chain, and people who know me know I have brethren inside of the EOS community, but we saw a perfect example of that when EOS launched their chain, and it just went straight downhill, which is why there's so many sister chains now, because of how that initial EOS launch happened, with the buying the votes and delegating and backroom deals, and they just sort of ended up in the same system we have now. I would encourage anybody here who hasn't already delved in. I would start looking at the DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, because there's so many of them, and they're approaching voting and fairness. Whether you're talking about MakerDAO or what is that? Aragon runs a DAO. There's a ton of DAOs, especially in the DeFi world. I would look at those as test cases for different approaches we might be able to use as we get ready to roll this out. So before I turn it back over to end everything to Jacob, I'd like to give Thom and Mark a last chance to say any last words they want to say about it, and where people can learn more about what you're doing or follow you or whatnot. And let's go ahead and start with Thom this time.
Thanks. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you for having me. To keep in touch with me, I've dropped my Twitter in the chat. For anybody who's looking to start experimenting with some of the tools that I've described, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'll send you some tokens in my native blockchain Edgeware, and you can test out delegated voting, nomination and staking, council elections, proposal making, treasury motions, council motions, tons of really cool gov tech being played out as we speak. So happy to onboard you to that.
Mark?
Yeah, well, similar to what Thom said, thank you guys for having me. It was a pleasure. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit from what we had to ramble about. And I know I learned from myself kind of chatting, and from Thom as well. And my best recommendation for all of you guys is go and experiment with DAOs. Like, if you want to reach out to Thom and test out what Edgeware is doing, definitely do it. The best route that I've found from learning how some of these protocols and products actually work and the benefits behind them is by actually using them, believe it or not. So I highly recommend, even if it costs you like $5, $10, $15, go and just try it out. If there's a vote going on in a product that you've heard about or potentially used, just go and make a vote, see how it works. Look at some of the discussions on the forums around them. I believe there is a whole thread about a bunch of different types of DAOs that are currently being built. I'm never going to say that a DAO is finished. It's always a work in progress. But go and check them out. And as I mentioned, experiment with them, whether it's around voting or just experimenting with just a random product on a blockchain. Experiment with it. Experiment, because that's how you're going to learn. Going and reading about these things is beneficial, but until you actually go and play with it, sort of like it's a game, that's the best way to learn. That's about all I have. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I think I shared it in the chat. The company, if you want to follow what we're building, is called Numio. We're on Twitter called Get Numio. And then one of the projects that I'm helping out, who is building out a DAO, if you want to check them out, it's called Phoenix DAO. That's about all. Thank you, guys.
Very cool. This, I learned a ton. I need to like watch this again and debrief, because that is a lot of information. If anything, I'm gonna just keep trusting people that are a lot smarter than me to be driving this conversation. No, but for real, thank you so much to everybody for tuning in, and for all of our awesome folks on the roundtable here.
Thank you for hosting this, Jacob and Ryan and Collider family. This is awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Collider and Ultimetric.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our pleasure.
One area that's I've really been into the DAO system and looking at local currencies, running it through blockchain, and that's all going to involve DAO systems. And that's led me down the path of decentralized IDs, right? The DID system, which now I'm sort of at a point of the biggest core cases for blockchain are the money angle and the ID angle. I wonder, especially Thom and Mark or anybody here, because I think pretty much everybody in the room at this point has experience here on chain, how you guys feel about that, especially the IDs on blockchain and tying it in.
So I was actually working with a project who built out one of the identity standards on Ethereum. When it comes to an on-chain identity, I can go and mint an unlimited amount of on-chain identities. There's no real, I guess I should say, restriction to it, because they're all pseudo anonymous. When it comes to reputation that you build around that identity, that is where the value comes into place. Because when we're talking about digital identity, everyone thinks about driver's license, passport, things like that. That's not necessarily the end-all be-all for identity, because I imagine I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but most likely within 5 to 10 years, maybe a little bit later, we're going to be able to have these on-chain identities that we're able to use in different types of systems that don't actually require any type of actual off-chain information. And by off-chain information, I'm referring to a driver's license, your passport, things like that. But that information, just for clarity purposes, that information is never actually stored on-chain. If you store a driver's license or a passport on-chain, that is a GDPR violation. So anybody who says that they are doing that, please run, because you're not supposed to do that. You are able to store encrypted information called an attestation on-chain. So an attestation is just encrypted data that you're storing on a blockchain. And what that can be is, frankly, anything. It's just having a third party that is able to attest for certain information, whether that be for like KYC, AML, or that my age is of a certain birth year, or that I am an accredited investor or not. All of that information can be stored in the form of an attestation, where it is encrypted, so no one else can actually see that, but it is able to be proved through zero-knowledge proofs. So that information can be secured, so no one else can see it, but you can sign information using a private key and say, I own this information. This information is verifiably true. And then you can essentially go about your merry day. Does that sort of make sense?
I think it makes sense if you can verify that you are the owner of it. But what I see happening in the identification space is it looks like it boils down to two philosophies. Identification. One is like, there's an authority that says, which is the traditional status quo that says you are this person. They give you an ID, and then people can verify with that authority that you are this person. Well, the real experimentation that I see in particularly like is like how do I, as a decentralized way to do identity, is there's you can identify people through their map of connections, or their social network map, and so you have others verifying that this person is a real unique human being, and that seems to be the current focus on a lot of these identity systems, Bright ID being one of these.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard problem, but it's being worked on. It looks like progress is being made as one of these things that will evolve. Can it compete with the traditional system is to be seen, of course, but I'm rooting for it. But I think that's what it boils down to, because you're going to have places where governments are corrupt, or the authorities are corrupt, and can just erase people, for instance.
Right.
So how can we create this system, and that this one does have a lot of promise. So like if enough people can say attest that this person's a real person, and if you have like a nice diverse enough network of people that say so, then it's a probabilistic thing. This person is most likely 99% probably a real person, unique person, versus a puppet account. And it's
actually something that happened with circles recently. I don't know if you ended up using that. It operates similar in the sense.
Yeah, I did.
Did you get verified? Because if you haven't, I'll do it.
Oh, thanks. I did, but yeah, anybody else, I'll shoot me on Twitter, and I'll jump in there.
I was the personal ID where it really hit me at first was last year. I think it was when India, there was a whole population of people who had been refugeed there for generations, and to the point where India had given them IDs and everything. You're not citizens, but we know you're here. And then like one morning they woke up and India was like, yeah, we revoke all that. You're not citizens. And now they've lost all domicile anywhere. They don't belong to any country. So India's like, you got to get out, but now no country will let you in because you don't have any identification. And that's when it really first hit me about the ID part. And then as far as usage, I really think maybe it's not even with people and our own personal identifications that'll get run first. I'm thinking about like cars. When you start talking about autonomous vehicles, how can I trust that the car next to me is really getting ready to take a left and that it's communicating real information and it's not a hacker someplace lying to my car, telling me this car is going to do this? And you're going to need some kind of verified identity so every car knows the information they're getting is true, right? So I think IoT is going to be a real big spot for ID, and then that can carry over. But I don't want to hijack this into a decentralized ID meetup. We should maybe talk with our Collider brethren about having an ID on the blockchain conversation someday. And
do it next. I'm all about it.
Let them move on. I appreciate everybody's time and interest and participation, and I'm excited about what we can build.
I want to leave you with one quote that I got from Protocol Labs, and it says, "You don't get a passport to prove who you are. You get a passport to get on a plane."
Exactly. Right.
Which I think, what his point is that DID is kind of a solution in search of a problem in some ways, and then maybe we're thinking about this in the wrong way, and there's some completely different way that we can do it.
Yeah. What does identity mean, right?
Mm-hmm.